Hello everyone, we're excited to have you here today for this webinar on maximizing the ROI of your ERP with intelligent capture and automation. Our presenters today are Kevin Ryan and Sheldon Lysandra from Highland Software. So we appreciate that you're taking the time today for this post-collaborate trade show webinar, and I'd like to pass it over to Kevin to get us started.
Thank you, Rayanne, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us on the webinar today. The topic of conversation today is maximizing the ROI of your ERP system with intelligent capture and automation. We call it Better Together because the intent is to show how we help our customers improve speed, visibility, and control to complement their ERP system. While we integrate with many ERP systems, specifically today we're talking about the capabilities that we have to integrate with Oracle JDE, Oracle E-Business Suite, and PeopleSoft. We'll be talking today about how to extend the benefits of your ERP system. We're going to talk a little bit about our world, content services versus enterprise content management, and some of the evolution and changes that we see happening in our industry. And then we'll talk specifically about financial process automation with content services and how we've been successful at helping our customers to improve their efficiency, leveraging some of the capabilities that we provide here at Highland Software to complement their ERP system. So let's get started. The enterprise content management is oftentimes one of the largest investments. The enterprise resource ERP system or accounting system that companies utilize is oftentimes one of the largest IT expenditures that they have. And this screen shows some of the core capabilities that these companies seek to improve and drive through the use of their ERP system. Improving the business performance, making employees' jobs easier, ensuring reporting and regulatory compliance. But on average, organizations spend about 3.6% of their revenue, their annual revenue, on their ERP system implementations and projects. What the ERP system does well, specifically JDE and Oracle E-Business Suite, is recording and managing the transactional information surrounding your financial process applications. Storing financial information, invoice and sales order data, general ledger information, and tracking and reporting on the data that's stored in the system. The ERP system is the organization's, our customers, it's the system of record, and it is the core repository. Our solutions that we bring together for our customers, and some of the things that the ERP system is not designed for, and in some cases does not do very well, it's managing that unstructured information that drives those electronic transactions. Using accounts payable as an example, those invoices that we receive from our vendors, be it electronic invoices, email attachments, or physical paper invoices that are delivered by our vendors, all of the information that's provided on those invoices needs to be extracted, validated, and entered into the ERP system. And there's a lot of manual transaction processes that surround those activities. Controlling those external processes, the inbound information, as well as external information to retrieve that information and integrate to and from the ERP system. It's also that visibility and tracking from start to finish throughout the financial process within these organizations, that end-to-end processing. Those are some of the things that the ERP system is not necessarily designed to handle. It does well once the data is in the system, but getting that information accurately into the system is oftentimes a big challenge for some organizations. I want to talk briefly about some of the changes that we see happening in the industry. As I mentioned before, Highland Software is a provider of what used to be called enterprise content management. It's the ability to store documents and data and automate some of those business processes that complement the ERP system. Gartner one of the main analyst groups that watches over our industry, has declared that enterprise content management is now dead. And they're transitioning the concept of enterprise content management to a more current term they refer to as content services. And the evolution of the industry, and it's a very positive move for the industry, that transition or evolution of enterprise content management takes us from the concept of a static repository with limited entry and exit points for accessing that information to really the concept of content services, which is the ability to deliver that information to the users where and when they need it in a variety of ways. So it's making those services to interact with the documents and the supporting information, to extract that content from those documents, and to integrate with the ERP and other applications in a what we used to call a service-oriented architecture, or an individual service application method, and it makes the use of this information in the repository far more effective and far more versatile to help make our customers more efficient. This evolution of content services really improves our ability to address that gap and complement the ERP system. We like to break down the concept of content services into 6 major categories. The ability to capture and extract that information from those source documents, to manage that information through business process automation and workflow, to allow access to that information, be it on a mobile, through email, Outlook, or whatever your email client might be, the integration, the ability for reporting and dashboard reporting to measure and have visibility over what's going on in the process, and of course protection and long-term storage of that information. Content services provides us that complete end-to-end view and access to that information throughout the process. If we look at financial process automation, and today we're talking specifically about accounts payable automation, but we're also successful at helping customers beyond AP or accounts payable. We've also been successful at helping in accounts receivable, human resources, contract management, and other areas of the business as well. But the main tools are capture through optical character recognition and some of the tools that we have for capturing information, workflow process automation, multiple ways of integrating directly into the ERP system for validation and posting that information. As we mentioned a moment ago, mobile connectivity, as well as reports and audits. As we look at an AP team and how the labor associated with accounts payable in AP as an example, it usually breaks down into 4 categories. Oftentimes the AP team, one of the major challenges that occupies somewhere between 33 and 35% of their time is just getting information from those invoice documents, extracting and entering the data into the system. It's amazing how many companies today, billion-dollar companies, are doing that physical data entry and extraction of that information manually from either the images or from those physical invoice documents that they receive from their vendors. The second big challenge is workflow and exception handling, what we refer to as business process automation. Again, that accounts for about 35% of their time. And oftentimes, it's looking to see what work is available and what is ready to be worked on. Once those invoices through the AP processes come into the system, they're validated. If there's a pricing mismatch, we need to get that in the hands of the folks in our procurement team. If there's a receiver conflict, getting that back out to the folks that are handling that receiving, or routing for invoice approval automation, or checking those tolerances between what was on the purchase order and what was on the invoices. All of that comes down to what we refer to as exception handling. In a lot of organizations, it's a very, very manual process. The remaining third of the time in an AP team's efforts breaks down into two categories: helping support and manage interacting with their vendors, answering status questions, signing up new vendors, things like that. And the other category takes about 15% of their time, is monthly reporting and supporting audits and things of that nature. All of those things that consume the time of the AP team can be addressed through the automation that we're going to talk about today. Again, referring to visibility, speed, and control, one of the first key aspects of the project is the ability to capture that information from those invoices. And in most of the organizations we deal with, we need to support multiple on-ramps for the way in which they receive those invoices from their vendors. A lot of organizations are still receiving paper invoices through the physical mail. And according to some of the industry analysts today, that still accounts for over 25% of the invoices that are sent out today. A lot of organizations are moving toward electronic delivery through, we're getting away from faxes, but a lot of the email invoices are still, sent through email as attached PDF or TIFF file images, but we still need to get that information off of those documents. And a very small percentage in some organizations, a very small percentage, usually it accounts for 10 to 15% of the volume of invoices, is the XML or EDI invoices that are received electronically. Our solution provides ways to streamline and improve the capture and accuracy of the information from those invoices. Next, those invoices are routed through the workflow. If they're non-PO or expense-related invoices, those are coded and routed for approval. If they're PO-based invoices, they're presented to, they're evaluated against the purchase order for that three-way match, and then routed through the approval process for exception handling. If they're clean, a percentage, in many cases, a significant percentage of those invoices can be processed through, if they match up cleanly, and posted directly into the ERP system. Through dashboard reports, we can have visibility of the process from end to end, from the point of capture all the way through to posting and payment in that ERP system. So what else has changed? One of the major changes from the last couple of years for Highland Software specifically is we acquired one of our largest competitors. And one of the pieces of technology that we gained through that acquisition is the industry-leading capture solution, Brainware. Brainware is that optical character recognition that allows for one of the most, or if not the most, efficient capture tool in the industry today. Why is it different? We've had capture components as part of our solution for quite a few years now here at Highland Software. But Brainware takes that capture capability to a new level. It's built on some very, very advanced technology. There's been over 20 patents issued and over 40 patents that are still pending on the Brainware technology. Over $100 million has been invested in R&D for this solution. The Brainware tool provides classification, extraction of the information, and validation of that information to ensure that it is efficiently capturing and validating that information against the information that exists within the ERP system. It's built from the ground up as a with the ability to handle semi-structured, and unstructured information. Invoices are what we refer to as semi-structured content. Brainware is built on some capabilities that we refer to as a neural network, and it uses a variety of technologies to help us to read, similar to the way the human mind has the ability to understand information that is very complicated. This slide shows you, the human brain's ability to read content, even though it's not really in the proper order. It still allows somebody to read and understand what is intended on the page. Brainware has some similar capabilities to use things like pattern matching and intelligent capture technologies to extract and understand that semi-structured data that we might find on AP invoices or AR sales orders. The evolution of optical character recognition and data capture evolved from 20 plus years ago, what we called template-based recognition, which was great for things like catalogs and structured forms. That evolved to what was called free-form recognition, which was less structured information, to memory recognition under some semi-structured forms like invoices. We could see and remember, a FedEx invoice or a certain type of invoice. We could remember where that was, but it still required a tremendous amount of training to make that software accurate and accessible. Intelligent data capture, which is what's available now through Brainware, takes that to the next level. Brainware has the ability, through this patented technology we talked about, to leverage what we refer to as the distiller to learn the content, the data that you need, and to pattern search the documents. Even though it may have never seen this invoice before, it doesn't need to know explicitly where that information is. It doesn't use anchors or zones or specific keywords. It uses patterns and context information to see and understand where to grab things like that invoice number, that invoice date, the total amount, so on and so forth. It allows us, with minimal training, the ability to extract that information much more quickly. Not only does it handle the summary level information, but it can also extract that table related information and match that to the PO line information in the ERP system. It allows that validation through what is referred to as pattern matching. And it grabs that information and it can pass it on downstream to our workflow, where we can facilitate that exception handling. So grouping together the summary related information and that detail information, it can see and understand who's this vendor that sent this invoice, match that to the vendor table, and then pass that information downstream. It reduces that data entry time and the labor associated with that by 1/2 to 2/3 in terms of labor reduction, just associated with that data entry piece. All of this technology, Brainware, as well as the OnBase platform that I talked about earlier, is provided on a single platform, providing capture, the archival and management of the information in the repository, business process management, which is our workflow capability, WorkView for case management, and the ability to handle what we call enterprise file sync and share, which is secure ability to share information with people like auditors. All of this is built on the platform that supports not only that financial process automation, but as you can see on the screen, it helps all across the enterprise. All of this is built on the core foundation that provides our integration capabilities with those ERP systems, security, and the ability to offer full functionality for participating in these workflows and viewing these documents over the mobile to allow your teams to work where and when they want. All of this is provided either on-premise or in our cloud. It's the exact same software, and it's encrypted for security to ensure that that information is protected. OnBase is truly one platform provided by one team here at Highland Software to support and improve the efficiency of your ERP system. Beyond that, we talked about that visibility and the importance of being able to see and completely end-to-end see what's going on within the process. And our reporting dashboards provide that capability. But furthermore, we can even drill down into those individual dashboards. And that's what Sheldon is going to show us here in a moment. So again, to recap, bringing content services together with your ERP system allows us to help our customers improve the speed, visibility, and control over their financial processes. With that, I want to turn things over to Sheldon and let him run through a demonstration of our OnBase and brainware capture capabilities. So with that, you should have control, Sheldon.
All right, thanks, Kevin. Give me 1 second to share my screen. All right, thanks again, Kevin. Hi, everybody. My name is Sheldon Lysandra. I'm a sales engineer on the Highland commercial team. And today I'll be walking us through the life cycle of receiving an invoice and the different user roles involved in a fully automated invoice processing solution. As Kevin mentioned, the solution consists of two pieces of software, brainware for the invoice capture and OnBase for the workflow processing, the document management, the reporting, and so forth. So to get us started, I always like to start with this slide, which shows how an invoice moves through our solution. The input here is maybe you're receiving all of your all of your invoices by paper. So those paper invoices, we'll scan them in. Any emailed invoices, we'll just ingest those into the system. Behind the scenes, brainware comes in and it does the OCR, the classification, and the extraction. Again, this happens all behind the scenes. When we're doing the extraction, we're really looking at how the invoice is classified. So was the invoice classified as a non-purchase order invoice or a purchase order invoice? Again, really telling us what to extract. Non-PO invoices will extract header information and footer, and then PO invoices will extract header, footer, and even that line item detail as well. And then we get to the validation step. So this is where we're taking that data and comparing it against your ERP. So whether that's Oracle, PeopleSoft, or JD Edwards, we're validating to make sure we have a valid purchase order number, a valid vendor, and valid line item detail. If at any point the system needs assistance from an end user, it'll stop and present the invoice in a verification form, and we'll see that later on in the demonstration. But after those steps comes the workflow piece, and there's really three outcomes when an invoice goes through intelligent capture and gets the workflow. The first outcome is sending the invoice all the way into JDE, EBS, or PeopleSoft to create a voucher or an invoice transaction. And we like to call that straight-through processing. The second outcome is GL coding and approvals. So any non-PO invoice that would need to be reviewed from a coding and approvals perspective, we'll send that into OnBase workflow. And the third option is exception handling. So anytime there's a price mismatch, or maybe an invalid purchase order number, or maybe a new vendor, we'll send that into OnBase for additional exception handling. So to start the demo, we're going to kind of start over here with these first four buckets. I'm going to go and minimize this slide for now. And I've already taken the liberty of scanning in 76 invoices. So if you look at my folder right here, I'll just bring up this first invoice. Of that group of 76 invoices, these are all different invoices. Some are from the same vendor, but for the most part, all of them are from different vendors. And I'll just kind of quickly scroll through these to show you that these invoices are all, again, from different vendors, but they're also different formats. The header and the footer information are all kind of all over the place. So really just to highlight and illustrate, again, different invoices. And this is important because, as Kevin mentioned earlier, we follow a non-template based approach. We use advanced algorithms behind the scenes. We use contextual information to determine values found on an invoice. So in essence, if we see invoice number, we're going to try and find candidates around that word invoice number. And as Kevin mentioned earlier, again, it's really best in class at extracting header information, footer, and line item detail. So what that means for you is that you can expect high rates of accuracy from a field level extraction standpoint. All right, so again, my 76 invoices have been through that OCR extraction and classification step. So if I pull up the verifier, this is the first step in our process, is verifying some of the invoices that Brainware wasn't entirely confident that it found the right values on the invoice. And so if I'm to play the role of a verifier, so think of this person as the person today in your accounts payable department doing the keying of an invoice into JDE, PeopleSoft, or Oracle. That role transitions into just someone getting away from that data entry and just verifying data. So on my verification batch right here of those 76 invoices, I can see that the state is sitting at 550, which just means my verifier has some invoices that they need to look at. I'll go ahead and launch this batch. And the first thing that Brainware does is it takes me to the first invoice that needs verification and even to the exact field that I need to verify. So you can see on my screen, my cursor is focused on the invoice number field. So what that tells my verifier is that Brainware just wasn't confident or entirely confident that it found an invoice number. And it's just asking my verifier to fill in that field. I'll get to that here in a minute, but what I wanted to point out here is of that batch of 76 documents, notice here that I've got a message saying that there's 48 invoices that are already completed. So what that means is my verifier doesn't even have to touch those. For all intents and purposes, those flow right into the workflow. There's only 28 left to process. So again, of that 76, I only have to deal with 28. And you'll see as I scroll through a couple of these invoices, how easy it is to verify and to correct some information. So on this particular invoice, what we're looking at here is our verification form, and on the right is our scanned in invoice. On our verification form, it shows us things like header information. So let's say if I click on the date field, it'll show me exactly where it picked up that invoice date on the scanned invoice. And if I scroll in to view that a little closer, give you a better view. PO number as well. So there's the PO number kind of sitting in the middle of that invoice, so hiding in there in the line item detail. We've got our footer information, and then that hard to find line item detail, we've got that as well. So on this particular invoice, what Brainware is asking us to do is just verify the invoice number. It couldn't find a great candidate. So if I zoom back out, we'll look at that invoice and say, okay, well, maybe the reason it didn't pick it up is because it just says number here, and all the context around it, it's a good candidate, but we just need to enter that into the field. So I can just double click as a verifier on that number that right there, fill in my invoice number, and then I'm done. I've corrected my invoice. So when I hit enter, this will take us to the next invoice. On this particular invoice for ProStaff, what happened here is my balancing amounts didn't total up correctly. So here in my pink fields, where again, this shows us which fields we need to verify, it's asking me to find a subtotal against this total amount of $8,000 plus. So the balancing amount here, I'm just gonna go over to my invoice, find where the subtotal is, double click, hit enter, and I'll see if my amounts match up. Now notice here I've got a message saying that the total amount does not match the sum of the subtotal, freight, and tax amounts. Well, once I hit enter, this will actually do the math behind the scenes, and if everything totals up, it'll move me forward. All right, and this final invoice we'll look at from a verification standpoint is asking me to verify the vendor information. So this one looks like a non-purchase order invoice, and I can see that by looking at this field here. And it's looking for some vendor information, so it wasn't entirely confident that this invoice was for Ruth Scherer. And then we have some balancing amounts that, like we saw earlier on the previous invoice. So from a verification perspective, my verifier just has to check the vendor. So if I click on this vendor search button, this will actually look into the vendor tables from EBS, JDE, or Oracle and say, okay, well, which one is it supposed to be? Ruth Scherer is 86% confident that that's the right vendor. That looks right to me just from an eyeball glance. Vending Solutions is the next candidate at 28%. So we can rule out that vendor. Let's just go ahead and choose this one, make sure that we accept it, hit enter. Notice my field turns green, and then my balancing amounts here are a little off, so I just need to select the balancing amount on my invoice. And then if I look at the taxes, that looks like I got the tax right. I think it's just looking at a miscellaneous freight, or excuse me, a miscellaneous charge or freight. Let's just go ahead and pick this number as the miscellaneous charge. That can be the freight as well. But once I hit enter, that should balance up. Now, as I do this, one thing to note is that if this invoice is troublesome, we're getting this invoice a lot from this vendor, and we have to correct it every time. Well, we can always submit this as a candidate for supervised learning, meaning we can learn this invoice or really train it as a rule without having to create a template behind the scenes, so we can adjust kind of what's going on with our algorithms behind the scene to compensate for this invoice and to pick up those values. The last thing to say about this invoice is I have a box up here in my verification form for invalid reason codes. So let's say our vendor wasn't found. We didn't have a vendor for Ruth Scherer. We can select one of these invalid reason codes. And as I look at my drop-down list, you can see the different invalid reason codes. So for example, we have vendor not found, or missing invalid purchase order number. So if we validate that purchase order number, don't find a valid PO number. These invalid reason codes really just send the invoice downstream to an exception handler within workflow. And you'll see an invoice in one of those work queues as we go forward. So I'll hit enter, we'll go to the next invoice, and we'll kind of stop from there. But what I do want to share with you is one invoice that went through perfectly without anyone touching, or really just comes in from the scan. So this invoice for advanced network devices, you can see here on my verification form, everything is in green. So again, my verifier didn't have to touch this invoice, but for demo purposes, I just want to share with you one that went through all the way. So when we get into the workflow, we'll actually see how this was posted into EBS, the specific one for advanced network devices. Okay, with that being said, let's go ahead and move into the workflow piece. So we've completed the validation or the verification steps. We'll move into the workflow piece, and this happens all in OnBase. So we're looking at my Unity client. This is the first client I'll share with you. There are a couple other clients I'll share with you, and it really depends on your user role on what client you might use. So here on the Unity client, I'll go ahead and log in as my AP clerk. And if I'm playing the role of a clerk, the first thing I want to share with you is just my workflow behind the scenes of how invoices come in and how they get routed to the individual queues like we're seeing here. So this first queue right here is the evaluation queue. Now, since we've extracted all of that data from an invoice, we're using that data to create our logic behind the scenes. So for example, non-purchase order invoices, if we notice that we've labeled one as a non-PO, we'll simply route it to the accounts payable swim lane here for coding and approvals. Exceptions will go into the review queues. And then, as we mentioned, anything that goes straight through without having to be coded or having any type of exception, will route it to this queue, which integrates back to PeopleSoft JDE and EBS. So this is where we're taking that data, sending it forward, and creating a voucher. So the next step that I'm going to show you is jumping into OnBase's personal page. So as an AP clerk, this is how I've set up my personal page. My personal page, it consists of different workflow queues. So I can see these big tiles, which represent the coding queues, approvals, which invoices have posted into PeopleSoft, JDE, EBS, and then my exception queues down here below. I've also got shortcuts to other parts of the software. So I've got some reports I can look at, a document search. So we'll look at searching for invoices later, check request forms. But let's do this first. Let's go ahead and look at a dashboard, which shows me another view of where my invoices are. So maybe as a clerk or maybe as an AP supervisor or as a manager, I can log in the morning and I can see what type of work is out there for today. So on this dashboard, I can see that there's things out there in the coding queue. There's missing vendor invoices. There's invoices that have posted. If we look down here below at the invoice details, this kind of gives us another view of the individual invoices in a chart view or in a layout view or a graph view, excuse me. And it also shows us the queue that they're sitting in, which also can tell us the status of the invoice. As I work with the invoice or with the dashboard, I can click on any piece of the pie to filter my results. So if I just want to see my exception type invoices, I can click on that field. And then if I want to drill down a little deeper, I can see that there's one invoice that's sitting out there in line item matching or purchasing line item matching. I can double click on that invoice to view it. So it's like a low-level search just from my reporting dashboard. And from a dashboard perspective, on the AP side, we have dashboards for accrual reporting, for productivity type reporting, how long it takes an invoice to get from point A to point Z, and really also visibility reporting on how well we're doing with our OCR, the confidence levels, the percentages we're getting from our OCR extraction. Okay, so let's move back into our invoice processing. And let's start right here in this queue where it says pending post to JDE, EBS, or PeopleSoft. So these are the invoices that have moved through all the way. They've gone straight through. And if we look at that invoice we saw on the capture side for advanced network devices, if I launch it in OnBase, I can see my invoice. I'm also going to open this note up to see what the note says. This note says that this has been posted and we have a return voucher ID number 17, which tells my end user, yes, this invoice transaction has been created in your ERP. So my example for this part is going to be EBS. We've posted that transaction and now we can retrieve that from EBS. So to do so, I'm going to go ahead and close my invoice and just minimize OnBase for now. And I'm going to pull up Oracle EBS and show you the transaction that was created. So we've got our invoice for $3,100. We can see here, there's that matching invoice, the PO number is there, the trading partner, supplier number. Since that invoice has been created in Oracle, I've also created a link to get back to that scanned invoice. And I can click on this button here to get that. So I've got an embedded link directly in Oracle, which is great because my end user doesn't have to go to a filing cabinet to find that invoice. They can just pull it up directly from the invoice workbench in EBS. So here's that same invoice for advanced network devices. And the nice thing about OnBase is we can create relationships with other documents. So if I want to view a purchase order or a packing slip, maybe we're capturing those at the dock, directly from the invoice, I can double click on the invoice to view those related documents. So you can see here my list shows a packing slip and a purchase order. And this might be a copy of the purchase order coming out of Oracle. So we can capture those outbound transactions into OnBase. And this would give us a complete look into what's happening with the invoice. We've got the invoice, we've got the PO, we've got the packing slip, and we can even capture checks into the system. So if you want to capture copies of checks after they're cut, after they're sent out to the vendor, we can store those in OnBase as well. Okay, so again, this is an invoice that went all the way through. We like to, again, call this straight through processing, zero touch invoicing, or I've even heard it called the happy path one time or another. All right, so back in OnBase, let's talk about coding and approvals. So you can see my non-purchase order invoices have landed in this queue right here. Now, maybe it's not my clerk's role to actually perform the coding and the approvals in this queue. I've got an approver role that has to do that. Now, instead of doing it from here in OnBase, what I'll share with you is just another way that someone in AP or in the approval role can get to an invoice and then code it and approve it and move it on. And I'm going to show you our integration to Outlook. So when I'm in Outlook, typically what happens is we'll send an email or a notification anytime an invoice hits a work queue. So we'll get a list of those invoices. You can see there's 4 different email notifications that my approver has received. And in this case, I'm playing the role of Cindy Smith. She's my approver. So let's just go ahead and launch this invoice here for Tulsa Personnel. Just to point out a couple things here. On the attachment, I've got a copy of that invoice that I can look at. Then also in the body of the email tells us a little bit about the amounts of the invoice, who the vendor or who the invoice is from, and so forth. I've got a link down here below. So for those users who don't use Outlook, or if you're a Google Mail or Lotus Notes, you can leverage this link here in the email message, fire up that link and approve your invoice via our web client. But for this portion of the demo, what I'm going to show you is how I can stay in Outlook to do all of my coding and my approvals just by clicking on this button here, the workflow task pane. This will show Cindy the different tasks that she can use. So on the right here, I've got my different tasks. The first thing she's going to do is click on the Display Distributions button. When she clicks on that, this will do a couple things. It'll launch the invoice so I can view it, and this will also launch a coding form. So my coding form here on the right, and I'm going to move that over. And this works really nicely when I have a dual monitor. So I've got the invoice on one screen and I've got the coding form on the other. But this is a little bit of integration back into your ERP as well. So we can see that we've got the header information, the vendor detail, again, information we extracted from Capture, and then our coding. So you can see on this particular invoice, a line's already been coded. So what OnBase can do is auto code for those constant vendor invoices you get, maybe those ones you get every single month. We can always auto code those, or we can always manually code. So on my section down here for GL coding, I can always add a new row and add additional GL codes if I'd like. Now these GL codes sync up to your ERP. So what that means is we don't have to free-form any codes. All this is being pulled back. So these are from your ERP. So these are all valid codes that we're putting into this form. And we use all this data once it's been collected to create those transactions in your ERP. So we'll share this data, post it into EBS, PeopleSoft for JDE, and create that voucher. All right, so once we've coded an invoice, let me go ahead and close out of here. Now we just need to approve it. So here on my workflow task list, Cindy can approve the invoice. So just by clicking that approval button, notice down here below on the original email message, we've got an audit trail of the date and timestamp of when she actually approved that invoice, and you can see that down here below. All right, so my invoices move forward. It's now going into the next step of approvals, and within OnBase, we can build as many hierarchies or really follow your structure of approvals throughout OnBase. So if I go back into OnBase, we do have the concept of workflow approval management, where we set up all of your, not only your approval hierarchies, but also delegating your authorities to other users. So if you're going to be gone for a week, as an approver, we can delegate someone else to approve your invoices. So from an approval level, I'll show you this really quickly. So we'll refresh this queue here. Notice here, from an approval perspective, the invoice has moved on. Really briefly, what I'll also share with you is just how I can approve an invoice via my mobile device. So if I'm going to move this over, show you my mobile device. So I'm on my iPhone right now. I'll go ahead and sign into OnBase via my app. And notice here I've got a few options. So I can approve an invoice just by clicking on the workflow button. I can see that there's an invoice that I need to approve right here. So for Boone Electric, I'll go ahead and open that up. I can see the keyword data there of the invoice. And I can also view the invoice by clicking on the document button, and I'll raise that up so you can see that. But the document button is here where I can view the invoice, and then I can use my tasks list. So when I click on that on my iPhone, I can just simply say approved, and that'll move my invoice out of the approval queue onto the next step. So just to summarize on the approvals portion, again, we can set up your approval levels. We can set it up for coding, approvals, to help your approvers interact with invoices much more quickly than ever before. All right, from an exceptions handling standpoint, here's 3 invoices that are sitting out in exceptions. So my first bucket here are for invoices that might have an invalid purchase order number. It might be a duplicate invoice. Maybe a vendor has changed their price. So what we're really doing here is triggering a workflow to send it back maybe to a purchaser. So if you think about, what happens when an invoice comes in and there's some amounts off that are just not matching what was originally purchased, we can route those invoices back to that purchaser. So if I launch this invoice, you'll see that I have a different task list. And let's just say that there's a quantity mismatch on this particular invoice. We can see that reflected in the note. So we're doing a lookup against Oracle, JDE, or PeopleSoft to look at that quantity or price information. And let's just say we need to send it back to the purchaser. In this case, I'll hit my needs review icon. We'll select, let's just say this goes back to operations. We'll hit submit, and off the invoice goes into another workflow process. And then if we look at our exceptions list down here below for missing vendor, I'll skip this one for now, but the missing vendor queue is another way we can kick off a workflow to verify a vendor, create a new vendor, work with the vendor. If you think about how your vendor maintenance queues work today or how your vendor maintenance process works today, you might get the invoice, call the vendor, and set up their paperwork and everything they need to create the vendor within your ERP or within your vendor master. But we're going to look at this invoice right here that's sitting in the line item matching queue. So after the extraction of an invoice on the Brainware side, Brainware then sends the invoice data into OnBase, and that's where we look up the receipt data in your PeopleSoft, JDE, or EBS system. If there's a mismatch on the line items, then we'll send it here. So if we look at this particular invoice, I'll go ahead and launch this one for French Carolman. There's another note on here, so let's read what this says. It just says, please compare the invoice information to the PO. To look at the purchase order information, we can click on the tasks and then also pull up a form which shows me some of the purchasing information. So if I look at this particular form here, on the bottom is all the lines that have matched up and then one line that didn't pair correctly. So I know that because these 3 lines were able to identify a line number on the original purchase order or even the receipt tables. If we look at the invoice, we can see there's actually 4 lines. We extracted 4 lines, but this particular line, POW banner scanner, wasn't able to pair correctly with the purchasing information. So for my exception handler to clear that up, all they simply have to do is click on this magnifying glass. This magnifying glass allows us to look into a view into EBS, PeopleSoft, or JDE. So we can have access to that data, look at the individual line items that are actually on the purchase order or even the receipt information. We can double click on that field to accept it, and then we can save that, and then now we're all cleared up. Okay. So really what we're accomplishing here is a little bit of manual pairing. Brainware will do its best, Brainware and OnBase will do its best to pair that information together, hopefully to go straight through, but there will be times where you'll have to manually pair your information like I did here in my form. Okay, so let me go ahead and save and close that. that form, I can go ahead and send this to my ERP for processing. So if everything clears up, we can move that forward and post that into your ERP. So as I refresh this field here, notice my workflow kind of updates my queue, and now I have 5 invoices sitting in that queue that are either posted or ready to be posted. All right, and just a couple other things to share with you today, just from a document search. Kevin earlier mentioned auditors who might need access into OnBase and to pull back invoices. So if you think about when your accounts payable department gets audited, if you're in a paper world, you might be fishing through filing cabinets, but with OnBase, once we capture those invoices, we can provide the document searching just by keywords or any other type of values here. So on this particular invoice, particular search I'm going to share with you, notice here I can search by PO number, invoice number, who the vendor is, and some date fields. I'll just go ahead and hit the search button to show, kind of an open-ended search of everything that's sitting in my accounts payable drawer. So I've got things like checks, I've got non-purchase order invoices, packing slips, PO invoices. So we can store all those type of documents within OnBase and give them a label. I'm just going to go ahead and open up the APPO invoice drop-down, and you can see all of the invoices that are labeled PO invoice. I can further filter that by selecting in the column the vendor name. So I'll choose Office Supply Warehouse. I can open up an invoice if I'd like. To view it, I can use some pinch filters. So there's some other filters I can use. So I can do a range between invoice totals or invoice date. So again, a lot of different ways I can interact with a search. So if you're an auditor, maybe the idea is we'll give that auditor temporary access into OnBase. They can do their own searches like you can see here. And then that auditor can even, based on their privileges, maybe they want to send all of those invoices via email or out to file or even print them out. So you can see I've got some different options here on the send to functionality. Okay, and the last thing I'll share with you from an end-to-end solution is just how a vendor can look at the status of different invoices. And to do so, I'll pull up our vendor portal. So for those vendors that you would want to set up who would maybe want to see the status of their invoices, maybe they haven't been paid yet, and they just want to check on their own without having to email or call you, this is how they would interact. So we can pull up the vendor portal. I'm going to sign in as a vendor named Vince. So again, I'm going to kind of switch hats here. I'll sign in to the vendor portal. And we'll see some different sections of the vendor portal. I'll start over here on the right. So there's some instructions on how to upload an invoice. So maybe to take the burden off of your AP team on scanning invoices, maybe we'll instruct the vendor on scanning their own, and then they can submit it into through the vendor portal, which would then go into Brainware. Over here on the left, you can see a couple of things. I'll start here in the middle. So I can see the submitted invoices. So you can see there's one invoice out there for CW. If I scroll to the right here, you can see the status. It's posted in the ERP. Well, maybe Vince has a question on, maybe they didn't receive payment. So Vince can also submit a form. My vendor Vince here can submit a form to your AP staff to ask a question on the invoice. So, hey, the status shows that it's been posted, but I haven't received a check yet. And that's what we're looking at here from a vendor inquiry. I can submit this form into OnBase, and your AP staff can kind of start a case on why they haven't received or why the vendor hasn't received payment. All right, so I'm almost at my time, but just to summarize, so we looked at the capture of an invoice, how it posts all the way through into your ERP with the Oracle EBS example. We looked at approvals, GL coding, and exception handling, searching for invoices, reporting. So all of that can be done within OnBase and Brainware together. So like Kevin mentioned at the very beginning, better together. We really have a full solution from A to Z from from an invoice perspective. So with that being said, I'll turn it back over to Rayanne. And thanks everyone. And if you have any questions, we'll take them offline, or please feel free to reach out to us. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Kevin and Sheldon. That was